Brian Stiller, very well known across Canada, formerly the president of Youth for Christ nationally, and then president of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Currently the global ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance, but perhaps best known, at least in terms of the last decade or two, as the man who really brought Ontario Bible College into a new era, creating Tyndale College, now a university and seminary. An amazing story of transformation that, among others, highlighted in his book, his latest book, Find a Broken Wall, 7 Ancient Principles for 21st Century Leaders. And Brian, you mentioned right off the top of the book, when you read leadership books yourself, you always check the flyleaf to see if the guy's ever led, which I think is not a bad idea. You certainly cannot be faulted for not having led. You've led and led and led and led. Why your fascination with Nehemiah? Because he really provides the paradigm, if you will, for this whole, or the thesis for this whole book.
I don't remember when I met Nehemiah, but I remember when Nehemiah became very formative in my thinking. And it started this way. I had finished Youth for Christ after 16 years, wonderful experience of learning how to lead ministries at the local level in Montreal and Toronto, and then the national president. And it was during a time when youth ministry was radically changing, the youth movement was coming into being, and we were doing some very different things to what Youth for Christ traditionally had done. So it was time for me to leave. We had gone to the place that your cousin is now pastor in Langley. They had invited us to come as minister, and Lily and I wanted some time to reflect. So I went to George and Pauline Spaetzel's place up in Blue Mountain for a couple of days, and all I had with me was the Bible and a notebook. And my prayer was, Lord, I don't know what we should do and where we should go, but lead us. And so I started reading in Genesis and just ambled my way through, picking up chapters here and there. And I came to Nehemiah, and I thought, I haven't read this in a while. And so I read the whole book. And I was making notes as I went along. And when I finished reading Nehemiah, I had written, find a broken wall. Find a broken wall that people ignore. Find a broken wall that people make fun of. But whatever you do, find a broken wall. And I knew that this church in Langley, Christian Life Assembly, was not the place to go. It was a great church, but it wasn't a broken wall. A few minutes later, I got a call from a pastor, Merv Saunders, who had met with Harry Fott, a good friend of ours, who had started the Evangelical Fellowship, and said, Brian, it's wrong for you to go to that church. And I said, well, what should I do? He said, we think you should take and develop the Evangelical Fellowship. And I said, yeah, but it has no office, it has no... And I started to describe a broken wall. And the more I talked, the more I realized I was talking myself into a call. And so from that point, in a self-conscious way, Nehemiah became a mentor to me as I continued to read and reflect about the various stages of his life. And so ultimately then the book became about that.
Yeah, and I appreciated the fact as I was reading it how autobiographical it is. It's if I can say this, compared to, you've written I think 13 books, most of the other books, it is softer, it has less of an edge, it's more approachable because of that autobiographical element to it. And I'm not saying the other stuff isn't good, it is, but it's kind of prescriptive writing you've done in the past. This is far more approachable, if I might make that comment. I found it really a fascinating read because of that autobiographical factor. Really,
yeah, personal stories have a way of inviting people into the text.
Well, yeah, and you're not triumphalist. You don't brag on yourself. In fact, you talk about some of your failures and some of your weaknesses and flaws. Not to excess, but you do. And it really makes the book all that much more human. When you talk about leadership, certainly there's so many books out there, so much theory. The point that you make somewhere in the book, and I can't remember where it is that ultimately, regardless of academic training and preparation, you learn by doing. And this really has been your great teacher, hasn't it? You have been a doer, and you've learned by doing.
Yeah, there's no other way. When I left Youth for Christ, when I finished university, Lily and I moved to Toronto in 1964. I finished university here at the U of T, and my first assignment was Youth for Christ in Montreal. And when I arrived there, it was in a sense bankrupt. It was just after the Man in His World, 1967. YFC was in terrible shape. So here I was thrown into this as a university grad, theoretical up to my eyeballs, but having to deal with the mess on the ground and to rebuild. And that was the best experience I could have had.
Now, when you write, and by the way, for the sake of those of you who are interested in the book, he does give, as he says right off the top, 7 ancient principles for 21st century leaders. You take the first 2 chapters talking about chaos. Listen for opportunity in chaos, recognize opportunity in chaos. You have said to me personally, a crisis is invaluable. A crisis is the best opportunity to really make a change, to really make a difference, to really reinvent something. This has been your experience.
It is. My theory, and I think my theory bears witness in your life as well as my life and others that I've observed, is that as I listen, and listening is a learned discipline, and you and I as type A talkers, we aren't good listeners, but we have disciplined ourselves to listen. But as you listen, I hear what is consistent with what I'm able to do. If I'm not able to do something, respond, solve something, I probably won't hear the problem. As I hear the problem and as I resonate with the problem, for me, it's an indicator that I have the gifting capacity to do something about it. So when people say, what's my gift? I ask, what do you hear? What do you listen to? As you listen to a variety of things, what catches you? Because that, to me, is always an indicator of what one's capacity is.
Yeah. What you're good at, in many ways, is a very strong indicator of what your gift is.
That's it.
Yeah, what you're good at. Now, you were president of EFC. You had brought EFC to a place of national prominence. I think you and David Maines were seen as the most high-profile Christian leaders in the nation. You were interacting with leaders on high level. You were very well known and respected on Parliament Hill. And you were really making a way for evangelicals as a spokesman. Why then did you say okay when Ontario Bible College came your way in a totally bankrupt, hopeless situation? And for, 2.5 years, do 2 jobs at the same time? And why did EFC allow you to do that?
Well, Jim, it's interesting. When they called, Dave Collins called me one night. He was vice chair of the board and said, we need a president. I said, I'm not interested. And he said, well, we need a president. I said, I'm not interested. And in the end, and Ken Birch, our dearly beloved friend who's now passed on, was chairman of the board. And so I called Ken, and Ken said, give them 3 months as a volunteer president. I realized that if this school went under, it's the oldest of its kind in Canada. It was formed in 1894. It had a huge history of training pastors and missionaries and lay people. If it went under, we would have to recreate it. So why let it go under? So I stepped in, and for that first year, rebuilt the board. At the end of the year, they asked me to come. And I had no interest in coming. But as Lily and I were reflecting on it, one day in a conversation that Lily and I were having, I heard the Spirit say to me, Brian, you've built EFC as far as you need to. Now I have something else for you to rebuild. It was as clear as that in my mind as I've said to you. And that's when I decided to come. But then we had a vision for what the school could become. A university, a larger seminary, a new campus, making it going from the cul-de-sac where it was, metaphorically, it was literally there, but metaphorically from the cul-de-sac to the main street. And that's been my vision all along, is that evangelical Christians of any kind need to be forceful in the public of our culture as a witness in a humble and a thoughtful and a caring and serving way, but nevertheless forceful as a presence of Christ within the broader culture. So that's what I wanted to bring the university, or the Bible college, transferring it to university and bring it into that mainstream.
And you also physically have moved it next door. I mean, so it's out of the cul-de-sac. It's now on the main street.
Yeah, we got this 56-acre site of the Sisters of St. Joseph.
The most beautiful site, I think, in northern Toronto. I just still am agog at how that happened. Your wife played a little role there.
It did. We were in the middle of when I just arrived at the school and it was bankruptcy, we were driving up Bayview and I stopped to let a car out of this beautiful site of 56 acres of gorgeous property and a marvelous campus. And as I stopped, Lily in her very quiet way turned and said, "Honey, someday the Lord will give that to you." And I still get that chill that I had then because I realized that Lily was speaking prophetically, and lo and behold, some 10 years later, the Lord provided the money and the access to buy it.
10 years later and a lot of fundraising. And I find it interesting in your chapter on fundraising to leaders, you make the point that fundraising is a critical, in fact you call it litmus test of your leadership. A lot of leaders find fundraising to be distasteful. They buy into the notion that people don't want to hear you talk about money. Yeah. You make the point in your book that that's never been your experience.
Yeah, my formula is simple. A leader has followers. But how do you know you have followers? One of the ways to test whether you have followers is to whether they're providing any of the resources to what you're doing, because if they aren't providing any of the resources, they really aren't followers. So it becomes a litmus test in that sense. So the building of resources becomes a responsibility of the leader in one way or another. One may be an aggressive fundraiser, him or herself, or you simply find the way of generating revenue. But ministry must be self-sustaining. It has to be ongoing. Otherwise, it's just kind of a one-day wonder. So the building of resources is critical to the role of a leader.
You don't talk about this in the book. We only have a minute left. Just a quick précis of the last year or so in your life as Global Ambassador for World Evangelical Alliance. What has that done? What has that brought your way?
Well, it's given me the globe to be concerned about. I go to many, many countries in desperate situations, and I found how beautiful and transforming is the simple message that God loves you, God cares about your country, He cares about your people. And to find that as a message in its simplicity and also in its complexity as it's worked out, but to discover how that love of God expressed by a person when you're on the field in their world means to others.
And it's interesting that leaders of nations like China, for instance, see the World Evangelical Alliance as one of three players in terms of the Christian world. You, the World Council of Churches, and the Vatican. Right?
Yes.
And take you very seriously because as far as they're concerned, you're representing, what, 600 million citizens of this planet.
That's right.
Well, Brian, there's nobody better positioned to do this than you. And there's so much more we could talk about, friends, but the book, you need to read it. It's called Find a Broken Wall. You know Brian, you trust him, you respect him. The book is certainly worth the purchase. And you can get it by logging on to crossroads.ca, or you can call 1-800-265-3100. Either will get you access to the book, reasonably priced.
This Saturday we have a book launch in Scarborough at Faith Books at 2 o'clock.
Scarborough, Faith Books, 2 o'clock. Terrific. Thanks, Brian.